Book 2, Part 1, Chapter 1. While we were completing the dispersion of the forces opposed to us, the Emperor was employed in fixing his position. To reach the Russians, we directed our march along the frontier of Bohemia. But in consequence of this movement, Austria took occasion to effect alarm for her neutrality. And as if we had not enough to do with the winter and the Muscovites, she pretended to suspect that our passage across the defiles of the mountains might lead to an attack on her territory. The Emperor was not to be deceived by this pretext. What had happened with respect to Bavaria had taught him the degree of reliance which was to be placed on the faith of cabinets. He called out a new conscription, ordered the recruits it supplied to assemble immediately on the Rhine, and took into his service the troops of the Elector of Hesse, which had just been disbanded. He sent part of the Hessians to France and part of Holland and Naples, thus removing them from the places where there was a risk of their being prevailed on to mutiny against us. He did not, however, confine himself to these measures only. He garrisoned the fortresses, occupied the passes which covered Italy, and he assembled considerable forces at Verona, Brescia, and the Isonzo. The King of Bavaria also assembled a force on the Inn. Thus we were soon prepared on all points. Another object, not less important, was to bring the resources of the conquered countries into active operation. The Emperor took measure for this purpose with that superiority of view which distinguished him. He gave a new political form to the vast possessions which the fortune of arms had placed within his power. He divided Prussia into 4 departments, of which Berlin, Kustrin, Stettin, and Magdeburg were made the chief towns. He fixed the limits of each department, retaining all their former subdivisions and all the institutions which were calculated to facilitate the management of public business. He did not displace anybody. He allowed every public officer and magistrate to proceed as usual in the discharge of his duties, and merely required that he should not turn against him that portion of authority which was left in his hands. And Administrator General of the Prussian finances and domains and Receiver General of the taxes were appointed to superintend the operation of this vast machine, and to adopt such measures as circumstances might require. Each department had an imperial commissioner who was present at the deliberations of the boards for affairs of war and the domains, and each province had its intendant who discharged the duties of a prefect. Special receivers were appointed to take cognizance of the receipts and verify the disbursements. The violent passions and commotions which agitated Prussia required measures of repression to prevent plunder and vindictive acts. For this purpose, brigades of gendarmerie recruited among the landowners were distributed over the country, their force and stations being determined by the governor-general. The commandants of particular districts had, besides pickets of French troops at their disposal. To Berlin, as a central point of operation, particular attention was paid. The Emperor made the magistracy be appointed by election. 2,000 burgesses assembled and chose 60 magistrates. They also formed a national guard of 1,600 men for the police of the town. The regular collection of the revenue, which was soon extended over Hesse, Hanover, and the Duchy of Brunswick, Mecklenburg, and the Hanse towns, prevented waste, secured abundant returns, and supplied the wants of the army without harassing the people, while the Emperor was employed in adjusting the government of Prussia. Deputies arrived from the Palatinate of Posen to present an address from their fellow citizens, praying that he would proclaim the independence of their country. He received them in the most cordial manner, but refused to make the declaration they solicited. France, said he, never recognized the different partitions of Poland. Nevertheless, I cannot proclaim your independence unless you be determined to defend your rights with arms in your hands, and by all sorts of sacrifices, even of life. You are reproached with having, in your constant civil dissensions, lost sight of the true interests of your country, instructed by misfortune. Be now united and prove to the world that one spirit animates the whole Polish nation. I have quoted this answer because it shows how unjust were the reproaches cast on the Emperor for not proclaiming the independence of Poland at the commencement of the campaign of 1812. Independence is a power in itself. Nothing can prevent its recognition if it exists. but to proclaim it when it does not is to form for the sake of a foreign interest and engagement, the consequences of which cannot be foreseen. The emperor repeated in 1812 what he had said in 1807, and could not, without compromising France, do more than he did. I return to the affairs of Prussia. Earnestly, as an armistice was solicited by Frederick William, the emperor did not place much confidence in the sincerity of his declarations, but he aimed less at Prussia than at England. He was aware that the government of the latter power, though always ready to instigate to war, cared very little of the misfortunes of its allies. He took his measures accordingly. He disposed his troops in such a way as to be able to take immediate possession of the places he required to be surrendered, or to march against the enemy in the event of the armistice not being ratified. His plans having this double view, none of his orders were precise except the instructions which he directed to be transmitted to the Grand Duke of Berg. The emperor, says the Major General in his dispatch to that prince, orders me to inform you that he has received dispatches from Marshal Davout dated Sampolno the 20th at 2 in the morning. It results from these dispatches that the Russians arrived on the 13th at Warsaw, and that on the 18th they had pushed an advanced guard of infantry and cavalry along the banks of the Bzura, that is to say, to the distance of more than 10 leagues from Warsaw, to Yakasov and Lovitz. In the orders which I transmitted to blank on the 18th, I directed him, in case he should not have entered Thorn, to proceed along the left bank of the Vistula, inclining his march towards the right. Marshal Augereau received orders to follow the movements of Marshal Lannes, keeping at the distance of 1 day's march in its rear. Meanwhile, the armistice was negotiated. Marshal de Rock, who was sent to the King of Prussia's headquarters, arrived on the 20th at Graudenz, and in case of the King of Prussia should have ratified the suspension of arms, the emperor had determined that Marshal Lannes should occupy Thorn. Marshal Augereau, Graudenz, and Danzig, and Marshal Davout, Warsaw. But in this new state of things, His Majesty is of opinion that Marshal Davout's force will not be sufficient to occupy Warsaw, even during the period of the armistice. It is therefore the emperor's intention that you should repair to Warsaw and occupy it with General Mielau's brigade of cavalry, which has been reinforced by the 1st Regiment of Hussars, with the brigade of General Lasalle, which left Berlin this day, with Klein's, Beaumont's, and Nansoudy's divisions, which joined Marshal Davout some days ago, and finally with the whole corps of Marshal Davout and Lannes, which will make more than 50,000 men. If the suspension of arms be ratified, the light cavalry will leave the river Bug, and the remainder of the cavalry must be cantoned at the distance of some days' march from Warsaw, so as that they may be easily subsisted, and that these troops should extend themselves farther in proportion as the Russians retire. And the stipulations of the armistice are executed. The corps of Marshal Augereau should occupy Thorn, Graudenz, and Danzig, having its main body at Thorn. Such are the dispositions made with a view to armistice. If, on the contrary supposition, the suspension of arms be not ratified by the King of Prussia, Marshal Augereau will maintain his brigade of cavalry on the extreme left near Graudenz, lining the Vistula, and he will defile with all his infantry following the rear of Marshal Lannes at the distance of 1 day's march to the left bank of the Vistula by Brezek and Kofeld, so that if it should appear that the enemy is inclined to risk a battle before evacuating Warsaw, Marshal Augereau may be able to join you without his cavalry, which should remain detached along the Vistula to observe the left in case the enemy should pass the Vistula at Warsaw. You will take care that Marshal Augereau's corps shall always be far enough up the river to defend the passage between Warsaw and Thorn, and to maintain the junction of the army corps, which will be assembled at Posen with that at Warsaw. You will receive this on the 24th. You will then expedite the annexed orders to Marshals Lannes and Augereau, and will yourself proceed to Sampolno, so that you may arrive all at Warsaw on the 30th of the month, with your reserve cavalry and with the corps of Marshal Davout and Lannes, if the suspension of arms be ratified, and you will leave the corps of Marshal Augereau at Thorn to occupy Graudenz and Danzig, and if the suspension of arms be not ratified, you will arrive at Warsaw with your reserve of cavalry and Marshal Davout landed Augereau's corps, and you will have 80,000 men in the field of battle. On the 24th of this month, the head of Marshal Ney's corps will arrive at Posen, where his army corps will be assembled on the 26th, only 12,000 strong. In consequence of the corps, he has been obliged to leave behind him for garrisoning Magdeburg and escorting prisoners. On the 25th, the whole of Marshal Soult's army corps will be concentrated at Frankfurt on the Oder. Finally, Prince Jerome has received orders to depart on the 24th from the blockade of Glaugau to the Bavarian corps between 14 and 15,000 strong, and will be on the 28th at Kalitsch. I have ordered General Becker's division of dragoons, which is with Marshal Lannes, to join you at Saint-Polno. The 25th Dragoons, which left Berlin today, is ordered to join Becker's division. The Emperor, as may be seen, had echeloned his troops with admirable foresight. He had everything ready. Whether the war should be suspended or continued, he was equally prepared. But his measures only reached England by starts, and that power he wished to touch to the quick. Our victories had increased our influence. We commanded an immense extent of coast, and we were masters of the mouths of most of the great navigable rivers. The Emperor resolved to strike with the very arms which England wielded. She had laid our coast under an interdict and had proclaimed a blockade which her fleets were unable to realize. The Emperor adopted this vigorous conception and determined to close the continent against England. The measure was violent, but England disregarded every right. It was necessary to put a term to her aggressions, to compel her to abjure her unjust pretensions. The progress of civilization has long since set limits to warfare. The operations of that scourge are usually directed solely against governments and no longer extended to individuals. Property is not made to change hands. The warehouses of the merchant are respected, and personal freedom remains undisturbed of all the conquered population. Only the combatants, those who bear arms, incur the risk of losing their liberty. These principles have been sanctioned by many treaties and have been recognized by all nations. Now, however, the English asserted pretensions which they never put forth until they captured Toulon, and the War of the West had annihilated our navy. To lay it down as a rule that private property found on board of merchantmen under an enemy's flag must be seized, and the passengers made prisoners, was bringing us back to the practice of those barbarous ages when peasants and soldiers were alike reduced to slavery, and no one escaped the grasp of the conqueror except by paying him a ransom. The Minister for Foreign Affairs, who reported on this subject, justly branded the odious pretensions of England and the grounds in which she founded them. His reports made an impression on us, the recollection of which I still retain, and more particularly the impression produced by the last. That report was in these terms: 3 centuries of civilization have given to Europe a law of nations, which, according to the expression of a celebrated writer, human nature cannot sufficiently acknowledge. This right is founded on the principle that nations ought in peace to do as much good, and in war as little ill as possible, according to the maxim that war is not a relation of man to man, but state to state, in which individuals are only enemies accidentally, not as men, not even as members or subjects of the state, but merely as its defenders. The laws of nations do not permit that the laws of war or the right of conquest derived therefrom should be extended to unarmed, peaceable citizens, to dwelling houses and private property, to articles of merchandise, and to the warehouses which contain them, the wagons which remove them, or the unarmed vessels which carry them through rivers and seas. In a word, to anything which constitutes the means and property of private individuals. This right, which arose with civilization, has favored its progress. To it Europe is indebted for the growth and the maintenance of her prosperity amidst the numerous wars with which she has been distracted. England alone has recurred to the practice of barbarous times. France has done everything to mitigate an evil which she could not prevent. England, on the contrary, has done everything to aggravate it. Not content with attacking trading ships and making the crews of unarmed vessels prisoners of war, every individual belonging to a hostile state she holds to be an enemy, and has accordingly made factors and merchants traveling on commercial business prisoners of war. Having remained long behind the nations of the continent who preceded her in the route of civilization, and having received from them all kinds of benefits, England has formed the insane project of securing the sole possession of those advantages by wresting them from other nations. With this view, she has, under the name of right of blockade, invented and put in practice the most monstrous theory. According to the principles and practice of all civilized nations, the right of blockade is only applicable to fortified places. England, however, pretends to extend it to places of trade which are not fortified, to unarmed ships, and to the mouths of rivers. A place is not blockaded until it be so completely invested that nothing can approach it without being exposed to imminent danger. England has, however, declared places blockaded before which she had not a single ship of war. She has done more. She has dared to declare immense coasts and the whole of a vast empire in a state of blockade. Next, deducing from a chimerical right and a supposed fact that consequence that on a simple declaration of the British Admiralty she might make prey, and really making prey, of everything going to or coming from the places put under interdict by such declaration, she has alarmed neutral navigators and driven them from the ports which their interest and the laws of nations invited them to frequent. The natural right of self-defense permits us to oppose any enemy with the same arms he uses, and to make his own fury and folly recoil on itself. Since England has ventured to declare all France in a state of blockade, let France in her turn declare that the British Isles are blockaded. Since England considers every Frenchman an enemy, let all Englishmen or subjects of England in the countries occupied by the French armies be made prisoners of war. Since England seizes the private property of peaceable merchants, let the property of every Englishman or subject of England of whatever nature be confiscated. Let all commerce in English merchandise be declared illicit, and let all produce of the English colonies found in places occupied by the French troops be confiscated. Since England desires to impede every kind of navigation and maritime commerce, let no ship from the British Isles or colonies be received into the French ports, nor into the ports of any of the countries occupied by the French armies, and let every vessel attempting to proceed from these ports to England be seized and confiscated. As soon as England shall admit the authority of the law of nations universally observed by civilized countries, as soon as she shall acknowledge that the laws of war are the same by sea and by land, that those laws and the rights of conquest cannot be extended either to private property or to unarmed and peaceable individuals, and that the right of blockade ought to be limited to fortified places actually invested. Your Majesty will cause these rigorous but not unjust measures to cease, and determine, for justice between nations is nothing but exact reciprocity. The Emperor approved of the principles laid down by the minister and adopted the proposed measures. He prohibited all trade and correspondence with England. He declared that country in a state of blockade, cut it off from all communication with the continent, and placed it in a situation the disagreeable consequences of which it very soon severely felt. Chapter 2. These measures being taken, the emperor set out for Poland. He knew that the Russian army was continuing its march and for the success of his subsequent operations, it was important not to afford a time to cross the Vistula, as otherwise we should have been obliged to fix our winter quarters in a bad position or to recross the Oder to winter in Prussia. In the latter case, Silesia, where we had operations to pursue, would have been left uncovered, and we should, moreover, have seen the Prussian army recruited by the Poles, who, as it was, ranged themselves under our banners. These considerations determined the emperor to make the army take the field in the month of December, and it marched at once upon Warsaw, Thorn, and Dachau. It encountered no obstacle nor any Russian troops except a few hundred Cossacks at about 15 to 20 leagues on this side of Warsaw, of whom no notice was taken. When it reached the banks of the river, the bridges of boats were reconstructed by the resources of that country. The bridges of Warsaw had just been burned. It had been built on piles, but it was rebuilt with boats. The bridge of Thorn, which had also been on piles, was but slightly damaged, and the bridge of Dachau, which was of boats, was rebuilt as before. We had found in the arsenals of Berlin all the resources of the Prussian monarchy, which, combined with those we previously possessed, enabled us in a moment to smooth down difficulties which appeared insurmountable. For example, the 3 bridges above mentioned were so rapidly restored that our troops were not delayed an hour. They had to cross some terrible marshes between the Oder and the Vistula. The emperor performed this journey in a carriage. Marshal Duroc's carriage, which preceded his, was overturned in a bad part of the road. The marshal had his right clavicle broken, and he could not be removed until a conveyance was sent from the nearest village to fetch him. Next day, the emperor arrived at Warsaw. His entrance to the city was hailed by the Poles with enthusiastic delight. However, he could not remain there. The Russian army was approaching, and there was not a moment to be lost. He made the chief portion of the army advance on the Bug by the way of Warsaw. The rest advanced by Thorn and brought its right into communication with the portion which had proceeded to Warsaw. All the troops who had crossed the Vistula below Thorn marched on Marienburg and Elbing. From that moment, Danzig had no communication with its metropolis, Königsberg, except by the tongue of sand which separates the Frischhafen from the sea. The right of the army, which had advanced to Warsaw, soon fell in with the Russians, who were retiring across some plains of black, dusty earth, which the rain had converted into marshes. It was found necessary to quadruple the trains of the artillery in order to get it forward, and consequently a great number of guns were left on the road. The emperor maneuvered the corps who had arrived at Thorn and who were destined to intercept the communication between Price, Eylau, and Warsaw, so as to force the Russians to abandon that road. But unfortunately, they encountered marshes in the course of their progress, which obliged them to advance slowly to avoid the necessity of leaving their artillery behind them. The scarcity of provisions was speedily felt. Fuel and forage were not wanting, but no provisions had yet entered Warsaw, and consequently none could reach the army. Nothing but the naturally cheerful spirit of the troops could have enabled them to bear up against these privations and fatigues. The emperor frequently showed himself among them. On these occasions he was always on horseback, and he regarded neither fatigue nor danger. The soldiers were always overjoyed to see him. He conversed with them, and they often said the most singular things to him. One day, when the weather was dreadfully bad, a soldier said to the emperor, "It was a fine whim, truly, to bring us to such a country as this without bread to eat." On which the emperor replied, "Have patience for only 4 days. That is all I ask, and you shall then be cantoned." "Well," said the soldiers, 4 days, that's not very long to be sure, but after that, remember, we shall canton ourselves. The emperor liked the men who thus used the freedom of speaking frankly to him. He was always persuaded that they were the bravest. By dint of patience and perseverance, we at length came up with the Russian army at the entrance of the forest on the other side of the little town of Pultusk, where it had formed itself for the purpose of covering the road from Maklov to Price Eylau. as well as that leading from Ostralenka to Grodno. The emperor immediately gave orders for the attack. There was but little artillery on either side, and therefore the discharge of musketry was kept up with vigor. And as we were hourly reinforced by some new corps, which had succeeded in getting through the mud, we had about 3 in the afternoon so great a numerical superiority that we attacked the Russians' line in front, broke it, and dispersed it in the woods. The enemy was pursued for several days. That part of his army which had taken the road to Price-Eylau fell in with a series of echelons of our troops, by which it sustained considerable loss, having 50 or 60 pieces of cannon taken, and 7,000 or 8,000 men made prisoners. The emperor kept his promise to the troops. He felt that it would be cruel to require them to make greater sacrifices, and he accordingly ordered the army to be cantoned. It was posted on the Vistula, the infantry as closely as possible, and the heavy cavalry on the left bank. The light cavalry had to pass a bad winter, for it remained in the country which had been abandoned by the two armies and where it was incessantly harassed by the Cossacks. The Russian army retired behind the Prego, occupying Königsberg as a central point. The emperor established himself at Warsaw. This was on the 1st of January, 1807. He calculated on remaining there until the return of spring, and he proposed to employ the interval in endeavoring to obtain peace. He sent orders to M. de Talleyrand to join him in Warsaw and directed him to inform the foreign ambassadors who were in Paris that he wished them also to repair thither. This measure was attended by several good effects. In the first place, the ambassadors thus obtained more speedy and correct information of what the emperor had to communicate to them, and next they were not misled by those false reports which are always circulated in a great city like Paris. Austria sent General Vincent from Vienna to the imperial headquarters, and in lieu of Monsieur de Metternich, who remained in Paris. I do not know whether this arrangement was made in consequence of any wish manifested by France, or whether it was a spontaneous measure of the Austrian government. The concourse, which was now assembled at Warsaw, once more restored it to the importance of a capital. A certain degree of form was observed in every department of the emperor's household, which exhibited all the luxuries and elegancies of French life, unaccompanied by any appearance of ostentation or effort. So much dexterity and promptitude was observed in packing and unpacking that a service of plate had been carried from Paris, used during the whole campaign, and brought home again without sustaining the slightest damage. Our halt at Warsaw was delightful. With the exception of theaters, the city presented all the gaieties of Paris. Twice a week the emperor gave a concert, after which a court was held, which led again to numerous meetings and private parties. On these occasions, the personal beauty and graceful manners of the Polish ladies were conspicuous. It may truly be said that they excited the jealousy of the most charming women of other nations. With the most polished elegance, they combined a fund of information, which is not usually found even amongst French women, and they are also very superior to the generality of females bred in cities, to whom habit renders company almost a necessary of life. The Polish ladies of rank always pass one half of the year in the country, where probably they apply themselves to reading and the cultivation of their minds, and they return to spend the winter season in the capital, graced with those talents and accomplishments which render them so peculiarly attractive. The emperor and all the French officers paid their tribute of admiration to the charms of the fair Poles. There was one whose powerful fascinations made a deep impression on the emperor's heart. He conceived an ardent affection for her, which he cordially returned. She received with pride the homage of a conquest, which was the consummation of her happiness. It is needless to name her when I observe that her attachment remained unshaken amidst every danger, and that at the period of Napoleon's reverses she continued his faithful friend. While time passed away thus agreeably at Warsaw, duty was not neglected. The emperor made every exertion to revictual and provide for his army. The frost had now dried up the roads, and convoys could proceed among them. them. But the utmost disorder prevailed in our commissariats, and in the midst of an abundant country, we were on the point of experiencing the severest privations. The state of things caused the emperor to be dissatisfied with the intendant general, who, however, was not altogether at fault. He could only write an order. But as each general in the cantonments occupied by the troops under his command ruled with absolute authority, he might, if he chose, forbid the execution of the intendant's orders. The emperor was obliged himself to superintend this business, and he issued a strict prohibition against those abuses of authority which must inevitably have proved fatal to us. At the same time, to obviate all future conveniences, he determined that the provisioning of the army should be performed by the Polish Regency, who wrote directly to all its agents in the different provinces. These agents were directed to report on the least opposition they might experience from the generals and other military officers in the execution of the orders they received for supplying the army. Order was then established, and Warsaw was plentifully supplied. The distributions were regulated, and the magazines soon overflowed. All that now remained to be done was to make arrangements for the hospital service, to provide the necessary means of relieving the sufferings and recruiting the strength of our invalids. To this object the emperor directed particular attention. His solicitude on this point may be judged of from the following instructions, which he transmitted from Posen to the interior intendant general. Posen, December 12th. First, 6,000 mattresses are to be made at Berlin without the least delay. For this purpose, 320,000 pounds of wool in the magazines, and the 16,000 ells of packing cloth or ticking at Berlin and Spandau are to be used. As soon as 200 mattresses are made, they must be forwarded to Posen, and the rest sent successively. Second, 12,000 tents shall be immediately employed for making 9,000 pairs of sheets, and an additional 12,000 tents shall likewise be used for making 40,000 shirts and 40,000 pairs of trousers for the service of the hospitals. As soon as 5,000 of these of the above articles may be completed, they are to be sent by the most expeditious conveyance to Posen for the service of the hospitals in Poland. Third, 1,000 mattresses shall be contracted for at Posen. The intendant general shall order 2,000 coverlets and 2,000 mattresses in Lower Silesia, and an equal number of both articles in Stettin. 4,000 coverlets shall be ordered in the department of Kustrin, and more particularly at Landsberg and Frankfurt. Fourth, the price of the articles ordered as above directed shall be fixed by the intendant general, and their payment shall be deducted from the contributions levied in each department. As soon as 1,000 of the coverlets ordered by the department of Kustrin shall be made, they must be forwarded to Posen. It must be so arranged that 1,000 are delivered before the 18th of December. Therefore, it will be advisable to take those in preference which are already made. Fifth, there shall be attached to each hospital in Poland a Catholic priest to officiate as chaplain. He shall be appointed by the intendant general. This priest shall also superintend the hospital attendants, and he shall have a salary of 100 francs per month, to be paid upon the 30th of each month. The hospital attendants shall be paid daily by the direction of the chaplain at the rate of 20 sous per day, independently of a ration of provisions which shall be distributed to them. The hospital director shall pay the attendants in the presence of the chaplain out of the funds at his disposal, which will be hereafter specified. 6. The intendant general, out of the funds placed at his disposal by the minister for the War Department, will arrange so that each hospital director shall always have in his treasury and in advance a sum equivalent to 12 francs for each patient that the hospital is calculated to contain. These funds will be employed in paying the salaries of the attendants and in purchasing trifling necessaries such as eggs, milks, etc. Meat, bread, and wine shall be supplied by the commissariat, and it is expressly forbidden on the responsibility of each individual that any application shall be made to the municipalities for trifling necessities, such as those above mentioned.